Citizen 12 is brought to you by Complexify, a social purpose corporation founded to support you living in alignment with your conscience and discerning what that is. Find out more at complexify.org. complexiphy.org.
Hello, citizens. My name is Paige Hulsey.
And my name is Emily Bogen.
And this is episode 8 of the Citizen 12 podcast.
Citizen 12 is not a program or health treatment, but an inclusive place, common ground to share and learn. If you have not yet listened to episode 0, we invite you to do that. You'll get a good sense of what this show is about and hear our steps, which were inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous, and those can also be found through any of our sites.
A little more of a preface. This show, this content may stir stuff up for you. In some ways, that's part of the point, but also we acknowledge that this can be hard, uncomfortable, even disruptive. Please engage with us responsibly and don't be on your own with stuff. Be in touch if that's the right thing. We care about you. It's why we're making this show.
Our podcast is created in Seattle, Washington. We acknowledge this as Duwamish land and strive to honor the past, present, and future Indigenous lives here. Citizen 12 supports Duwamish tribal services by paying real rent. Find out more at realrentduwamish.org.
Today's show is our follow-up to our last episode about power and autonomy. I was a little surprised by the topics that came up for us to address out of our last episode, but nothing new there particularly. And in episode 6, we mentioned this whole I did my best thing. You know, that thing people say, I did my best. And when I said it like that, that makes it sound like I'm making light of when people say that. I'm not. It is a thing people say, and we're going to talk more about that thing that people say, I did my best. But we're going to use this as an occasion to talk about excuses and more about responsibility and the oh-so-sticky topic of being a victim. In our first segment today, let's talk about assuming the position of responsibility. So this isn't, I think the first thing to say is that this isn't about, for the sake of this show, we're not talking about actually getting to the truth of culpability. Like, we're not talking about legal responsibility. We're talking about, like, the choice to take the stance that I'm responsible. You get the difference between, like, technical legal responsibility or culpability and then, like, as a way of being?
Right.
Okay. So my experience is that taking this position, and I'm going to say this because if for our listener, being responsible still seems like something to avoid, I guess I should say, and I think we've said it in the show before, we as people, human people, seem almost like bent to avoid being responsible. I think we did talk about in the show about like wanting to look innocent or be innocent.
Protecting innocence.
So it's obviously really like normal to want to be not responsible. And there are, in my experience, there have been these really big benefits to taking the position of responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I would say primarily the way to say it is that positioning myself as responsible allows me to see ways to proceed that I couldn't see when I was like, I'm innocent, I'm not responsible.
Yes, agreed. I think placing myself in a position to be responsible has ultimately, I think before I was living that way of life, if I made a mistake, I was way more inclined to just sort of see myself as that mistake. And that's kind of why being so defensive and trying to protect innocence was such a like reaction to any sort of mistake that I made.
Great addition.
Yeah.
Thank you. That I didn't, we've talked about a little bit before, but yeah, being able to uncollapse our behavior from who we are, make space for this, is part of how we can make space for this.
And I think just how much it creates space in the person too. Like, I want to emphasize like the before and after of after becoming someone who wants to be responsible or see mistakes, just how much room that gives me like inside of myself. What I think that I do is when I am hardwired to protect my innocence, I start to look for ways to give evidence to my innocence. So excuses and anything that would underlie victimhood.
Let yourself off the hook. Yeah. So that really, thank you for setting us up for our next segment about this hard thing to talk about, even just this word victim. I know using these words can be sort of so provocative that it can be hard to stick with the content, but we really think it's worth it to be able to talk about these issues, even though they're hard. I think the part of victim that I really want to talk about is this victim as a way of being, which is what you were just mentioning. And for me, it really means like when I'm operating as though I am sort of at the mercy of, like you use the word innocence. I guess I more frequently think about it in terms of being at the mercy of, though, which is similar. If I'm at the mercy of something, then I'm innocent. I have no responsibility, right? So if I'm being a victim, I'm being like I'm at the mercy of, and then I think of like circumstances, whether that's my environment or my own feelings or a thing we're going to talk about in a little bit, timing. But if I'm being a victim, I'm just like, well, it's on my environment. It's not on me. So it's really important to say, this is obviously not to say that those things, environment, feelings, or timing, aren't real or valid. You, Emily, and I both are really clear that those are real, valid things, components that shape and change lives.
So are you saying then, so while we honor those things, while we honor the importance and the effects that environment and feelings and all of that contextual, inner and outer contextual stuff plays, you're saying that there's still this other piece there. There's still room.
Well, yeah, I'm saying there's room to assume the position of responsibility. And then what that means is that there's still like what my role is to play, even inside of those circumstances. And this is not how it used to look to me. I mean, I don't know how much I ever really thought about responsibility or anything.
It's kind of like responsibility is the ticket to empowerment. It sounds like what you're saying.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I don't know how to find empowerment without choosing to take this position of responsibility. For me, it is what has given me access to identifying, well, like I said before, an array of ways to proceed that are obscured when I'm just being a victim or being like I'm innocent, protecting my innocence. Untangling being a victim as a way of being, like separate from, I haven't even said this yet, but from having been victimized. And if you've listened to this show consistently, you'll know we are not at all denying that victimization is a real thing. Of course, victimization is a real thing. Being damaged, being harmed, that's real. In my view, it's actually important to uncollapse these things to preserve the reality of victimization and then be able to address this other separate thing about responsibility.
Which can coexist. And this is something that I actually say to my therapy patients a lot is I want to take space here to acknowledge that you're a victim, that, you know, harm has been done to you, and that, but there's that sort of paradox in a way where there's still somewhere else, there's still other work to be done, or
well, yeah, let's look and see now what.
Okay.
Now, I mean, for me, that's kind of how I think of it.
And in no way are you undermining the victim, the reality of victimization, being a victim. Yeah.
Again, the terminology is complicated. And actually, you know, I have heard people try to excuse harm by saying, oh, don't be a victim. Do you know what I'm talking? I mean, have you ever? I feel like we hear it in the TV and movies and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really dangerous.
So somebody's being hurt, and then they're getting the message, well, don't be a victim. Well, I think that's really dangerous and hurtful and weird and unnecessary.
And I think it is like a stem of dualistic thinking. Like, you can't have both. You're either going to take responsibility and heal, and I think that that's where that comes from, is people saying, you need to heal, you need to move on.
I guess what that like has slid into ignoring the existence of victimization, which now it's so, I mean, maybe other people are having a different experience, but in my life, having been hurt and harmed, it gets ignored. I mean, people don't want to make space to acknowledge even the existence of people's pain and how they've been victimized.
Yeah, and I think it's like a fear of staying there, or like
I think that's part of it.
Yeah, like the idea of dwelling, or
that it won't pass. That if you
right.
acknowledge it, it'll make it more real. My whole experience is that that's just not it at all. In fact, continuing to try to have to prove to you that I've been hurt has actually hurt me more. And I think you've had this experience where when what's going on with you, whatever that is, gets acknowledged and seen and witnessed, that it can actually allow for the thing to like disappear or move or change shape or...
Yeah. But unfortunately, you know, you kind of need that piece of that acknowledgement. And if it's not coming from someone else, which I guess in our society, that's not a guarantee, you know, to be told, oh, you know, you're a victim of such and such, or you've been victimized.
Yeah. The way I do it with people is I say, I see that you are hurting. For me, that has been those words. I mean, obviously this word victim is so loaded and so confusing. Yeah. I definitely do stay away from that word. And hurting is so kind of basic. And I mean, it has been effective for me.
Do you say you have been hurt, or that you are hurting?
I mean, don't you have the experience that you're with people sometimes and you can see that they are hurting?
Yeah.
Okay, so then no, I wouldn't like pretend that it's concluded. I mean, I'm saying, I see that you are hurting.
Well, I would say one is more of when I meant you've been hurt, it's a statement suggesting that someone hurt them. And I do think that has to be clarified sometimes, because I think
acknowledge, because that's so often ignored.
Yeah.
So absolutely, you were one of the people, you were the person who kind of gave me words about myself that I am a space maker, that's something I'm actually pretty reliable for, is that I do make space for stuff that a lot of people don't want to make space for, including acknowledging pain and harm. So you're saying, yes, the acknowledgement, I mean, witnessing, these are not new concepts, that witnessing is this critical thing.
Yes. I just experienced this with you several months ago. You offered that to me, that
You've
space.
been hurt.
You've been hurt.
And I see that you're hurting. I mean, probably both.
I mean, whatever words that were said, but I do remember like the power of having been given that acknowledgement and the space that it created to maybe, you know, it moved things around. And
yeah. You know. You touched briefly on in our society, we can't really guarantee that we're going to get that externally. I would even go beyond that and say I have virtually never been able to get it, even when I tried to demand it of people and beg and do. I mean, I'm thinking even like, especially maybe as a child and adolescent, a lot of like, I mean, subconscious, but effort to try to get people to acknowledge stuff that seemingly nobody would acknowledge.
Well, what was that phrase you said earlier about trying to convince people or explain, or what did you say? Like having to say over and over what happened, or I forget what you said, but
I don't know
just
what
this
you're
idea of you were talking about
proving.
being caught in that place, and I think that we do that because
things that aren't acknowledged get stuck until they get acknowledged. I mean, to some extent. And I am still growing through, I mean, I'm alive still. I'm still growing through what it is that how I can take care of myself, what it is that I can offer myself in terms of witnessing and acknowledgement. And really, my experience is that I can do a lot between me and myself and my quiet relationship with the universe. You know, I'm talking about distinct from needing other humans. And then I have had occasion to make requests of people in my life to say, will you be with me, witness this experience that I'm having, and acknowledge that you see what's going on with me. It's a huge gift.
I think that's really good language to use. I feel like that's helpful.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think that we can move on to our next segment about timing. So all of this stuff about responsibility, as we've already said, is not to deny that there is clearly a reality to our circumstances. But particularly, I thought I'd talk about a component of circumstances that gets kind of, I don't know, I feel like I hear more trouble about it, this timing thing, than other aspects of circumstances. So I thought we would talk a little bit about what it's been like when we haven't been ready for something. This is when I think a lot of us think about timing. A bunch of examples come to mind. I'm actually thinking of a friend who was in a job that they knew wasn't really the right fit for them, but they just kept having this sense that it wasn't the right time. Like, it just wasn't time yet to move on.
Yeah, this brings up for me the phrase, he was just a man of his time.
I don't know that one.
It's what's said a lot about slavery. Like,
oh, yeah, as an excuse.
As an excuse. Okay. So it brings it up for me because it's like what we're talking about here, I think, is so powerful that maybe we can just get rid of that phrase. And I think that this isn't this is very related. Like, maybe we don't have to say anymore that he was just a man of his time if we really are doing this work and like kind of sorting out, finding empowerment despite timing, finding empowerment to maybe act differently.
So, wow, that was not where I thought we were headed with this.
Okay.
I like that.
Okay.
In fact, I don't know if you've ever read, there's some classifications of denial, psychological denial. One is temporal, where we make this excuse about, well, it's better now, which is a lot related to he was just a man of his time. Does that make sense? Temporal denial. It's like a classified form of
temporal denial.
Denial about timing. What I was thinking we would talk about is how, even though we're talking about responsibility, there does appear to be some really valid reality to timing. So not really what you were saying about like the culture or like that, but more like, well, you heard what I was saying about my friend who was in this job. She knew it wasn't really the right fit, but it wasn't time to move on. And that was valid. That was valid. It looks like you're shaking your head like, no, you don't think it was. Have you?
No, I agree with you, but then that's why that phrase popped into my head is like
that's such an excuse.
Yeah, and that's sort of like he was just a man of his time is kind of like an extreme version of that excuse. So I'm not so sure if I'm convinced of the timing thing, I guess.
Tell me about what it was like for you when you knew there was action for you to take in your life and you kept reporting to me for years that it just wasn't time.
There was this like sliver.
I'm kind of poking at you, obviously.
Well, I guess I want to admit, like, there is this sliver that's like, it can't be an excuse. It can't.
Okay, so I'm just going to interrupt. So the whole point of this show is that excuses are valid and real. They don't have to prevent us from taking right action. And I haven't really said that yet, but this is kind of the whole point of this episode, is that having been harmed, it's real and valid. That doesn't let us off the hook for taking care of ourselves or doing what there is to do.
There it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think. I didn't plan to share like a really solid example, but we've talked on this show about giving things up before. Let's talk about smoking. I've talked about that before.
Yeah.
Do you think I didn't know that it was a good idea to give up smoking before I did?
I think you knew that it was a good idea.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. In fact, I read some philosophy as a teenager, and I was like, if I truly know it's wrong, I won't do it again. And then, of course, I was smoking later that day. I mean, I have been I grappled with whether it was good or right or wrong or whatever to smoke from when I started smoking. And my sense is that there is some reality to when it's time to, when it was time. When it was time to give up smoking, I gave it up. And I'm not sure if I had control to make it be time before it was time. In fact, I'm going to say, and this could change at some point, but to me, it looks like that is not under my control. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And so what I think my barrier here is like logical, what seems like good timing, like versus, for lack of better words, God's timing. And like, it can seem really logical in my thoughts that this is when I should quit smoking.
I should quit smoking right now.
Right now. It's killing me now. And so that could really be used, I think, as a way to like beat yourself up, right? Like,
well, I think we I can't remember if you smoked. Or maybe you don't want to say.
I quit a year and a half ago.
A year and a half. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't. I think I've said on the show before, I have a really poor memory. So, yes, it can be an excuse while we're smoking to say, well, it's just not time yet. And we can beat ourselves up saying, but it should be time, but it should be. How many of us have found ourselves saying, I want to be ready to stop, or I want to be ready to change? I mean, I have had that experience my whole life. I don't see that this thing about timing isn't under my control. And I think that is really a good way of saying it. Now, again, the point here is that doesn't let me off the hook from doing what there is for me to do. So it might not have been to quit smoking, but it might have been, I think in the past, I let that block out all of the other actions it might have been good and right for me to take in that area.
And yeah, highlighting block out. Because I do think that that's what that does. If you are so infatuated with this should be the time I do this big step, the little steps aren't heard.
Yeah. I often think of this, and you had actually asked me to address this in this show about, I think it was when we had talked about the definition of spirituality, including like striving for growth. And you had said, well, what about when I don't want to do that? Because sometimes it's not time for that, right? And I said, yes, I really think that's true. The way I think of it is that the flowers don't bloom all year. Most flowers don't bloom. Of course, my mind just talked to me about flowers that bloom all year. But the point of the story is that there is a season to things in the world. And that for me, it wouldn't be it hasn't been appropriate for me to like push, grow every second of every day forever. I mean, that's just not how it's been. And in like seasons of, you know, not necessarily resistance, but like, and maybe not even dormancy, but quieter times, like there's been nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
That appears to be part of how this works, how life works,
right?
This seasonality thing.
Right.
And it has helped me a lot to make space for that for myself and others. You know, back to our last episode about trying to make people see stuff before they're ready. I mean, I haven't seen that that's useful. I haven't seen that it's effective.
Right.
Someone was just saying yesterday to me about how, you know, I think she said, she was, the way she said it, it made it seem like she knew that it was like funky, but I think she said, I just wish she had already grown more. And I'm like, yeah, sure, that I can relate to that. But that I have never been effective at like getting somebody to grow more than they've grown. Like to some extent, that timing, it's out of my control.
Just how much a person's going to grow in their life
is
in
out
general.
Well, of course,
yeah, right?
Of course. But then definitely the timing.
Yes.
We're pausing here to thank and acknowledge our listeners who have taken steps to support and share the launch of this show, specifically Heather, Katie, and Wendy, and all of the rest of you who didn't want to be named in the show. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Your time, attention, and encouragement means so much to us. And a reminder to everybody that all of our patrons have early access to episodes, and you can find out more at patreon.com/C12Pod. Okay, in this segment, we're going to talk more about excuses and responsibility. And I'm gonna start with a story about a friend of mine, and I want to say that she very explicitly suggested I use her story on the show, because when I spoke to her about how to talk about these issues, she said, just use my story. So, brief background about her. She had an abusive upbringing, which of course included and made there be a good deal of personal challenges for her in her life. She got married and made a family with a man with significant health challenges. And many years have passed. She's older, and her children have grown and have children of their own. And for the most part, their children, and she's still married to her husband, for the most part, her children don't really have contact with her, which unsurprisingly has been a source of pain for her and her husband. So all along through the years, you know, since her kids grew up, she kind of had thought that because she definitely didn't have control over the circumstances of their lives, that was sort of the end of the story of her responsibility. And she told me that she had like attempted to kind of repair her relationship with her kids and apologize, and it never really, I mean, it really had never worked. They still really just don't have contact with each other. And this came up, we were talking about it, the two of us, because she was kind of telling me that she really didn't want to be the victim about it. And I think she was even saying, look, I'm not the victim. But honestly, I could like hear in how she talked about it that I could still hear that she was being a victim, even though she was saying, I don't want to be the victim. I could hear that she was kind of confused about the whole thing. And we have enough background of relatedness and closeness that she really let me dig in, engage, and talk with her about this to see if we could like, you know, shake it up a little. And yeah, I think it was this proceeding as though because she didn't have control, that meant that she'd, here we go, done the best she could, right? Like even though she'd apologized, and this is why I could hear that she was still being a victim in her reporting about this, is that I could really still hear that she was in the position that she had done the best she could. And it didn't sound to me like she had really critically assessed if that was true. It was more like a reflexive, I'm innocent thing. Does that make sense?
So you're saying she identified almost completely as a victim, but was also denying that she was the victim.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean,
And
that's in such simple words. I feel a little funny about saying it, but yes, I think you would agree.
And you're saying also that, but in a large way, she had been victimized.
Yes.
But she was, hesitant to, come to terms with that. But she was identifying completely as a victim.
I don't know if she was hesitant to. Well, I mean, maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But it was more, I think, that her complication about this prevented her from seeing anything other than that she had done the best she could.
Right.
And actually, yeah. So she I could also hear that she was still pretty clogged up with her excuses, including that she was, yes, like you were just saying, she was sometimes not sure if her excuses were valid enough or not. So she would like go back and forth. Well, my husband was really sick. Wait, is that a good enough reason? Does that mean I was victimized? She had a lot of internal noise about the validity of her own excuses.
Okay. And so what I'm seeing here is just a really good example of just having to be one thing, not having that space to like, okay, I'm a little bit of a victim. I'm a little bit responsible. Like,
I hope I can invite you toward not using that term, I'm a victim.
Okay.
Because that really is the thing we were trying to untangle. I have been victimized. And I'm being a victim.
Right.
Distinctly, I'm...
Okay.
Yeah, and I know it's really hard, and it's why this whole thing, I think, is so hard, generally.
Right. But just the tangling, I think, and all of this confusion that I can just, like, feel that she had. Like,
yes.
Just this, as a result of just... that inability to have different parts of ourselves.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good thing to notice. So I want to make sure I say her, and this was an important thing for her to hear and for us to get to together. Her excuses were real and valid. Mm-hmm. They were valid excuses, but the excuses can be valid and still leave room for being responsible.
Right.
It's totally real that she did not have the tools or resources or skills to do a 10 out of 10 job for her children. But that had been an excuse that for her blocked out any responsibility. And it's valid, right? It's real. She didn't have skills to do it, to be a perfect mom. But it was like that was so outsized that it kept her in being victim as a position. And none of this changed how it actually was for her kids, right? None of any of the validity of her excuses changed the outcome for her children, which was hard and not ideal. So now for her, in part, seeing that her inaction was an action made some space for her to identify and take this position of responsibility for not doing something different than what she did. So I think that is the piece that she sees she's responsible for now. That she should have taken any and all of the actions that she did have access to. Right? So yeah, she didn't have access to a bunch of things. She couldn't control her upbringing or that her husband was sick. But that probably left a whole ton of things that she still could have done that she didn't do. And I have watched her come to terms with that that's a failure, which is really powerful.
How is she reconciling that, or how is she going to move forward with that? I mean, it's just how much regret she must feel, I imagine.
So honestly, I see that this has actually liberated her. And yes, regret, but regret, again, as I've said before, as this useful, empowering tool, not just feeling bad, which she's been doing for decades.
Do you have any idea of, did she share with you how she overcame the idea of, or the being too late, or of what, missing out on this chunk of time where she could have been better? Did she ever talk about that? Or
so
I think these are the things that would plague me,
So what she told me, so when we had this talk, if it's not clear in how I'm talking about her, I love this person. So we were talking about her and this stuff with her kids, and I asked, can we dig in a little on this? Can we talk about this? And she, again, this is why we're a good fit for each other. She was like, yes. And not everybody's up for that, which is totally valid, but she is, and I love that. And when we started to talk about this, she again and again said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to assert that it was her ego. Her ego was so thick around this stuff. I was like a safari guide, had to carry her through the rushes to be able to see through some of her own confusion and weird stuff about her excuses and witness old pain and all kinds of things. This was very, very hard won insight through, like you said, decades of stuff. And I mean, obviously she's not glad that she failed, but it just is how it is. Part of it I think is that she does have some, what I think of as emotional discipline, to not direct her attention to feeling bad about how it could have been. Or, I know these are common temptations, but she has a long-standing meditation practice. She's a pretty developed person. And I see that these are tools that make it a lot easier to not get washed away, or, even really spend time in, well, man, it's hopeless now. So she said to me, I was not ready to see this stuff until now.
Yeah, this is a really good example, I think, of that once we are ready to kind of step over the ego a little bit, that we can do it. We can't, this is a great example of a woman who can sit with this.
Yep. Oh, very, very powerful. And we do, it helps to have, what did you say? Failure.
A
yeah.
Huge life failure. Sorry if that's harsh, but
yeah, well, I would say whenever I have fallen down on my duty, that's a failure for me. And just like this, we've said taking inventory is this tool to get comfortable with identifying my errors. That's what that means, that I have failed. I didn't meet my ideal duty. And I'm really comfortable with that. I have had failures and made errors all over my life. I'm not saying I'm happy about that, but that appears to be part of life. And I find that it's way more powerful and realistic to be accurately related to the errors that I make than to try to pretend I don't make any, which appears to be the only alternative.
Right. I do think there's kind of a spectrum, at least for me, on some are more sticky than others, some are harder to come to terms to than others. Course. And this seems like one of those really big ones.
I think she was incentivized, right?
Yeah.
She loves her children, and there's pain for her that she hasn't found a way through these mistakes. So I think she was incentivized. Yeah. So my last little bit about that is this thing that I've come to, which is that even when I definitely legitimately don't have control over stuff and circumstances, putting myself in a position of responsibility allows me to see where I do have my part to play, my contribution. And I see that as my right role, my duty. I'm empowered by that. I think there was a time maybe when I was younger where that would have seemed like too burdensome. Like I think I liked the idea that I didn't have any role to play. Like I wasn't, I mean, that's how fully I think I was avoiding responsibility. And now, honestly, as somebody who's like dug into a life that of responsibility, I love and like honor and, you know, am excited to play my part.
Right. It's the payoff of responsibility, I think.
Yeah. That's a good way of saying it.
Mm-hmm.
In our last segment today, we're going to talk about what I think of as pendulums. And a brief note, the plural of pendulum always sticks with me. I guess pendula is allowed, but it wasn't ever actually a Latin word, so that doesn't really work. But there's something about saying pendulums, just like saying stadiums. I don't know. I don't like it.
Pendula.
I think I tend to avoid it, but it looks like pendulums is actually the preferred word. So that wasn't the point of this segment. The point is that I want to make is about how I see change go for people, and even this responsibility thing, giving up the way of being a victim and moving toward being responsible. Change can be like kind of convulsive and extreme, and I'm sure you relate to this. So, you know, maybe I should stick with the example we're on. So I'm going to give up being a victim. That might, unsurprisingly, propel us into trying to pretend no one's ever hurt us, which actually I think is part of why there's so much confusion around this. There's so much denial of any damage or harm in an effort to, you know, grow away from being a victim. We like go too far. The pendulum swings too far the other way.
I think this is the idea of how we relate to our parents is like a great example to this.
Like they're either perfect or they're monsters, and the pendulum it's pretty easy. And, you know, when I wrote this note in the show, I thought, well, could it still just be me that is so, you know, pendulum-y? And no, I mean, really, almost everybody I've ever observed go through change has this kind of convulsive overcompensation back and forth.
Well, yeah, it's like the dance around the ego. Like, I think it does have a lot to do where you are on the pendulum of where you are timing-wise, right? Like what you're ready to or able to suss out, see.
The meme that you mentioned in the last episode, I think it was something like, sometimes you just have to say fuck you to the world. You know, to me, that's like a good example of the pendulum maybe being at an extreme end. Like, I don't think you or I are particularly interested in taking a position of fuck you to the world, but I know you well enough to know that it was actually freedom and like a new way to not be over accommodating or having to be too nice, but like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell if that means no or
yes.
Okay, just to be, I mean, because I don't think that meme sums up what you think as like your good right relationship to the world.
Mm-mm.
That it's probably somewhere between saccharine nice and fuck you.
Right. Sometimes like those cathartic things can kind of bring us out of, I guess, like for me being over accommodating.
Well, so I want to talk about this. Well, I'm going to tell another little story about a friend about getting unstuck as access to getting to the right space. Mm. So it's another job thing. She was in a job. She was actually working as a nanny. And from what I could tell from what she told me, they were very legitimately mistreating her. She's a very nice woman, my friend. And she didn't want to leave them without a nanny. She had agreed to, you know, be the nanny for whatever period of time. And I remember thinking, no, man, you got to not ever go back there. That sounds terrible. And she was, you know, she was kind of stuck in, oh, but I have to be considerate. I have to be reliable. And I said to her, okay, I'm not really suggesting this, but part of me would rather see you drive to their house, take the car seat out of your car and throw it at their front door and yell, "Fuck you, you should never treat people like this," and skid away than ever go work there. And she laughed, right? I mean, I was being funny, but she could not imagine herself doing anything like that. So much so that she's stuck going back to a job where they're mistreating her. And so, and it unstuck her even to like play out that very extreme other side of the pendulum swing.
Yeah.
And she told me that what happened was that she wrote a letter, like a professionally toned letter, and dropped the car seat and the letter off and didn't go back to work there anymore, which in my view is like somewhere between just stick it out and let them hurt you and fuck you, don't ever treat people like that.
I've done both.
Yeah. So my sense for myself is that finding that sweet spot between the extremes, I mean, practice contributes to getting there and like being interested, but almost like God or conscience for me is required to actually hear the like that middle ground. And I say middle, it's usually not actually the center. I don't know, but between the two extremes.
Yeah, God is, conscience is that way of getting there for me as well. Yeah. That's what does it. That checking in, looking for guidance. Yeah. Listening for guidance. And then those little ideas pop up and it's usually kind of nice. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up today? Okay, we will undoubtedly come back to these topics again, but that's all the time we have for now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
This show isn't a thing without you. Please find us online, chime in, and write to us. We want to engage with you. We're in almost all of the usual places, all at C12Pod. That's C12Pod. It looks to us as though our community could really use this content, and we're excited to create and share it. This is a 100% listener-supported show, so if you already like what you're hearing, or even if you don't, but you think what we're up to is good, please contribute through Patreon at patreon.com/C12Pod. Your non-cash supports us too. Subscribe through whichever tool you use to listen to podcasts and submit a review wherever you listen. We're hosting Discord spaces for patrons, and if there's interest still, we will include a Dear Citizen segment in future shows. So support us and write in with your questions about practicing the principles of the steps. Our thanks to each of you who contribute to this work.
Thank you.